I think we'll get started. Michael, thanks so much for joining and speaking with the Xoogler School students. We've been talking a bit about sustainability on Slack, and I think people are also very interested in hearing about a career in product as well. So with that said, I think if you could sort of give a quick background and then love to hear about your career and also what you're moving into now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I feel like this whole presentation is a bit of a background. So a summary before we dive in. I was at Google for 10 years as a user. Well, my title changed only because we renamed the title, but it was user interface designer, and then it was user experience designer. But I kind of worked my way up the ladder, working on a bunch of different products at Google. I kind of cut my teeth on Google Finance and search, and then worked on Gmail. Eventually led the design team on Gmail for 5 years. I worked on Gmail for 5 years, and I led the design team for, I don't know, about 4 of that, 3 or 4 of that. I co-founded Google Inbox. I co-founded Google Fi. I went and worked on Android for a few years. I got to work a little bit on the intersection of artificial intelligence and like the future of mobile operating systems and some crazy stuff. I worked on some things that cut across Google, like Project Kennedy, which was the big Google-wide redesign way back in 2012. So I got to work on a bunch of stuff, and I had a lot of fun. And then I spent a few years at Facebook, and then I went and worked on climate change. So that's part of what we're going to get into. But a lot of years in design, and then the last couple have been kind of straddling design and product. And I feel like unofficially I did it at Google. I'd often kind of pair up with the PM. But I feel like actually running, thank you, Google. I feel like actually running product, which I did the last couple of years, is a whole nother ball game than kind of moonlighting. So I will share my screen. Is that a good background? Anything else you were hoping me to cover in that?
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Well, hello, everyone, to the faces I cannot see. And I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you. And we're definitely saving time at the end to do Q&A. So send them as we go. I was excited to hear that we're using Nori and upvote questions and stuff. I think that's fantastic. And I definitely want to kind of get to that because I think answering your direct questions is often one of them. Most valuable times during these talks, but hopefully I've got some good stuff to say as well. I want to talk about 3 things today. I actually took a gap year. I didn't know that. I didn't know of that term at the time, but I took a year off of college during my college career. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and what I did with it and how I got the most out of it. I wanted to talk about my career at big tech companies at Google, and I was at Facebook for a few years. And I want to talk about climate change. More specifically, how to think about working on climate change, or what I've learned about, after a couple of years working on climate change. I have kind of a way of breaking that down and thinking about the different opportunities there. So with that, we'll jump in. Act 1, gap year. I'll even go a little bit further back. I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. I loved trying to figure out how things worked, especially electronic things. I remember taking apart some of my various toys. So I figured I'd grow up and be an engineer. And I feel like that's kind of an idea that just lodged in my head. Oh yeah, I'll be an engineer when I grow up. That'll be great. I enrolled into Rice University in 1998 and to pursue a degree in electrical engineering. But I didn't graduate until 2004. And I got a degree in computer science instead. So one of those extra years, so that's 6 years, one of those extra years was a gap year after my sophomore year. The other was a 5th year I needed to finish my degree because it turned out none of the electrical engineering classes counted towards a comp sci degree. I feel like just as I had kind of fallen in or defaulted to electrical engineering, somewhat differently, I kind of fell into my gap year. Basically, I worked part-time through a fair bit of high school and most of pretty much all of college. And at the end of my summer, after my sophomore year, the company I'd been working for on and off said that, hey, your boss is leaving the company, and we would love for you to take a year off of school and take his job. I didn't feel at all qualified for that. This was the year 99 or 2000, somewhere in there. So during the, right before the dot-com bubble burst, and I feel like it seemed totally reasonable to hire an unqualified 20-year-old that was in college to take over for their boss's role, trying to build, well, I was working at a company trying to build an online electronic medical record system. That company didn't make it for various reasons. So the role scared the ever-living crap out of me, basically. So I said, yes, that sounds great. I learned so much from that year, from my gap year. I learned how much I loved making software, thus the change to computer science when I got back. And like I was kind of hinting at before, I kind of defaulted into a major. And I liked my classes. I liked electrical engineering. But I feel like when I came back, I really had a purpose. I was taking the classes so I could do something I'd already done to some degree, and that I wanted to do better. I wanted to get better at. So I would say, if you have the opportunity at a high level to do something that is related to the career path you are on, do it, especially if it feels like a stretch. At the same time, I would say, like, few have the opportunity kind of hand to them like I did. I was really lucky in that I'd kind of been working for this company and that they then, offered me this opportunity. That is not a typical path, I readily admit. So to that, I would say, go start something yourself. Go make up an internship, or go start a company, or start something with your friends, or make something. Just make something. And even if it's not real, even if it's like, hey, I'm going to redo the marketing site for this company, or I'm going to redo I'm going to build some software, or I'm going to build something. You can just go make something. I think that the closer that is to something that's real, the better. So if you're doing it with other people, you're doing it, for another company, or getting another company to, or people in the industry to kind of criticize it or give you feedback on it, the better. It doesn't need to be successful for you to learn, though. So just kind of go make something and see what happens. I got a lot out of working both during my gap year and while I was in school. The second thing I will recommend is, I feel like this is just a generally good thing to do during a gap year and not, but, constantly trying to get to know yourself. How do you process the world around you? What are your automatic patterns? What holds you back? Where do you thrive? How do you take care of yourself? Is that through, meditation or prayer or journaling or reading or running? Yeah, it's just so important to take care of yourself. An older friend of mine during my gap year recommended a sort of self-discovery class to me, and I figured, sure, why not? And it ended up being pretty eye-opening. There was a lot I learned out of that, and had a very positive impact on kind of everything I've done since. A few examples, I'll get a little hippie on you for a second, but I think this stuff really matters. A few examples that I got out of that. I learned, one, that resentment is a huge waste of time. It's kind of like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Like, forgiveness is not about being okay with what happened or being a pushover. It's refusing to hold ill will, or refusing to kind of drink the poison, if you will. So learning to forgive was a really valuable thing that kind of that was put in different words that kind of sunk in deeper. I learned how we're all our own harshest critic. Duh. We all have a voice in our heads that tells all sorts of little lies and a few truths. And the trick is to not silence that voice. It's to hear it and confront it. Learn to catch the lies and challenge them. Holding on to unchallenged, kind of lies or beliefs about how things should be or should have happened, or how they'll never be this way or always be that way. It just adds to our suffering. And lastly, I learned to stop kind of beating myself up about some of the things I saw as weaknesses, put in air quotes, and kind of learn to work around them. So for instance, like I consider myself a pretty epic procrastinator. And I stopped kind of beating myself up about that and just started learning to cope with it. So setting smaller goals, setting artificial deadlines helped me get stuff done. A class I ended up taking later, actually during my time at Google, put it a different way, is to invest in your strengths and make sure your weaknesses don't get in the way. So you're not trying to, like, if you think of like a video game where you have like the different little bar charts of the strengths of a character, you're not trying to get all those bars up to an even level. pick the one that you love, that you're really great at, and really, like, I think a career is about maximizing that bar, and then make sure the other ones are good enough to not hold you back. All right, so looking back, my gap year was pretty pivotal in my life. Working for a year gave me confidence in the workplace and clarity about what I wanted to study. I also saw how much more I learned by doing than by studying. So I changed my major to computer science when I returned, and I started a company on the side so I could keep doing while I was studying. And I would say that self-discovery class, and the things that flowed out of that experience ended up being really impactful too. I learned a lot about myself and gained a lot of confidence and comfort in my own skin, just as a human being, which was also, I think, really, really helpful. All right, so Act 2. So I finished college, finally. I had my computer science degree. I had my own company. I was making websites and web apps for people. And I had enough customers to pay the bills. So for about a year, I traveled around and worked from exotic places like Knoxville, Tennessee. And eventually I ended up in San Francisco. I found a room in a house I could afford, and I was pretty happy for a few months. It turned out working alone in an empty house was not near as much fun as when I did it in a dorm in college, surrounded by people and activities. So I decided to close down the company and seek full-time employment. I also kind of felt like jack of all trades, master of none. I kind of learned what I needed to learn to get projects done, and I was working alone, so that meant I had to do everything, which was really exciting and fun, but I wasn't getting like really good at any one thing. And I thought kind of picking a job, picking a role would help kind of force me to specialize. So over a 3-month span, I applied to well over 50 companies, I would say, for roles as software engineers, project managers, user interface designers. I knew I wanted to make something on the internet, and honestly, I was open to any role. And I think that that's also served me well through a number of cases. That kind of flexibility of like, look, I'll mop the floors, whatever it takes. How can I get my foot in the door? And that sense of willingness, I think, has served me in a lot of ways throughout my career. So early in my process, one of my rejections actually came with some advice. The hiring manager, this was for a software engineer. I was working in cold fusion that was a thing once upon a time. And he told me, he thought like my passions and like the questions I asked during the interview process and et cetera, he thought that really better aligned with being a designer, user interface designer, or user experience designer, as they're called these days, or product designer. We have so many different names for the same role. It's ridiculous. Anyways, that resonated with me though. So I started looking more for design roles while still considering other roles. Again, I kind of wanted a job more than, the perfect job. Through a combination of luck and skill, I would say, but mostly luck, in 2005, I managed to get a good interview at Google as a designer. And eventually I landed a job there. Quick tangent on job hunting. I would say it's a numbers game. So apply to lots of companies, be patient, have your favorites, sure, but it's a numbers game. I would also say like a lot of, job listings often have like minimum requirements. These are the required things. I don't think those are often absolutes. There's not a lot of science that goes into coming up with those. Sometimes a lot of thought went into it. Sometimes it was like, I don't know, grab them from the last job listing. And even then, there's plenty of research to show there's not always like good correlation that those requirements are what actually makes someone great or not great at a job. So I always try to be honest and open, like, hey, I don't meet these requirements, but I do meet these. And, I think I'd be great for these reasons. But I would never let the minimum requirements keep me from applying. You can always apply, and they can always say no. Another interesting one is, as much as you can, or test anything you send out. Like, an email you're going to write, or a resume, like, and, maybe y'all can buddy up and like kind of give each other feedback. But it's amazing how often my friends or family would catch stuff that I just didn't catch. So for instance, as a designer, I actually created a portfolio, and I tested this on the roommate of my girlfriend, and it tested horribly. Like, she could not use the thing. I was like being way too clever, and I built this whole elaborate interactive thing. And just like, I didn't have to test that on anyone else. I just saw right away from kind of doing that with her and asking her to do a couple simple tasks, or, tell me where she got caught up. It was just obvious that it wasn't working. So I totally scrapped it and redid it. And I don't think if I'd done that, I would have gotten a job at Google. And just, it's just like anything else. It's a skill. The more you interview, the better you're going to get at it. I don't think there's a whole lot you can do to prepare other than just practice. So you can do mock interviews. Those are great. But again, it's a numbers game. So just trust that even if you don't get that job, it will help you get it'll help you be better in the next one. And then let's say how you approach a problem can be just as, if not more important than your solution to a problem. So in any kind of interview, if they give you, how would you solve this? Or what would you do that? Like, think out loud, ask, clarifying questions. Well, what's this for? I love doing little design exercises in interviews and saying, and having people design a really mundane object. And one of the big things I was looking for there is, do they just take the problem as I give it to them and run with it? Or do they come back and ask me questions? Are they saying, well, tell me a little bit more. What is this for? What are we really trying to solve? What are our priorities? That kind of questions can help you do way better. Even if you don't solve it, even if you don't come to the right solution, how you think through a problem and how you collaborate with the interviewer is just as important. Okay, tangent over. So I was at Google for 10 years. I really enjoyed it. I got to know and work with a lot of amazing people on big products that hundreds of millions, if not billions of people use. I think, looking back, a medium-sized company is a great place to start a career. So Google was pretty large when I started. It was around 2,000 people. It's much, much bigger now. But the design and research team was no more than 30 people. And we all sat, in the same, kind of area with each other. So it was amazing. About 80% of the company's products, the other 20% just didn't have designers. The design and research for, that 80% of products was all sitting in one area. It was just amazing. So I think somewhere, and I've heard that number like 30 before, like, hey, if you're gonna go start at a startup, go find one that's like 30 or more, employees, because then they're settled and they're, into some rhythm, and it's not gonna be quite as chaotic. Somewhere between 30 and 2,000, those are random numbers. There's no perfect number, but I think, in that range is a good spot. The company's gonna be well enough established. You don't have to worry about it going under. You're not going to be asked to do too many jobs for, too little pay because they can't afford to hire someone else. But, and there's some more senior people that you can learn from that, again, learn by doing, but I also really learn by observing and kind of finding mentors or finding people that I think, wow, I really like how they do that. Let me really study how they're handling themselves in reviews or in meetings or with their work or with their deadlines. But it's small enough that you can still wear a few different hats. It's small enough that you can, you're not put too much in a box or just seen as a number. You get to see how things are connected and a lot of other interesting things. So I think that kind of middle-sized company is really powerful. Not to say that you won't learn and grow from a bigger company, but I think one of the other speakers that y'all spoke with talked about taking risks earlier in your career. And I would say take risks throughout your career or but especially if you can afford to take them. But definitely, I think that the big brand, the big company that you know and love, like going to work for Apple, may not be as a rewarding or educational experience as going to work for a smaller company. One of the other things, so on product design, it's another quick tangent, and then I think we'll shortly get into climate change. One of the things I worked on before I left Google was I tried to define what makes a product excellent. It was a sort of culmination of all I'd learned about product design in my 10 years at Google. So I thought I'd give you a quick taste of that. We basically define an excellent product as something that's focused, something that really solves a real problem with just the essential features. Having more features is going to be distracting. Having fewer, not enough features means you're not actually solving the problem. Ideally, some of those, at least one of them really stands out as being exceptional, as being like much better than whatever is out there. Something that's simple, that's intuitive, easy to ramp up on, easy to integrate into your life. I think so often people develop products with kind of blinders on, and they're not thinking about other products the customers are using alongside it, or just the rest of a customer's life. What else is going on? Being respectful of people's time, their expectations, and their privacy. It's something that's crafted, something that's made really well, that's robust, refined, beautiful, intentional, really kind of stands the test of time. So we had like a whole slide deck on each one of these things. I'm not going to go into that nearly to that depth, but I think one of the most important one on here is solve a real problem. You'll be amazed at how many products are made because a competitor made one and we've got to have one too, or because, you know, we've got this great technology, we got to get it out there, or it's a solution kind of in search of a problem, which occasionally works out, but not often. Or, you know, it didn't really solve it. We worked really hard on it. It doesn't quite solve the problem, but we've been working on it for so long. Let's just get it out there, you know, launch it anyways. So I would say solve a real problem or address a real need. And ideally, you know, this is where it kind of gets subjective. Well, what is a real problem? Well, you know, you can see that there's ways of finding out, do people really have this problem? And then you get to add your own layer of, do you think this is a problem worth solving? Do we need another photo sharing app, or do we need to solve climate change? You know, arguably those are not on equal footing, but maybe you have a bend on, you know, where all the photo sharing apps are kind of missing the boat. And if you have that clarity, you know, of what problem you're solving, what need you're addressing, talk to the people that have it throughout the development process. It's so important to talk to people. It's great if you are, you know, a customer. If you're making a photo sharing app, one of the great things is you can easily put yourself in, like, hey, I share photos, I know what that's like, which can be good and bad, right? It's good because it's a shortcut to finding out what people like you need, but it's bad because you don't find out what people not like you need. Okay, so towards the end of my time at Google, I was starting to get the itch to either start a company or go work at a startup, do something different. But I kind of felt like, you know, I've been at Google for 10 years. I kind of want to diversify my network, diversify my experience before I kind of make that jump. So Facebook came a knocking, and I decided, sure, let me go try Facebook out for a little while. I ended up there for about 3 years, and I decided I was going to leave halfway into those 3 years to work on climate change. A quick side note on leaving jobs and leaving teams. It is okay to leave. It is okay to quit. But I would encourage you to try not to burn bridges. I've always sought to try to kind of find a good handoff point or find a way to ease the transition, whether it's helping find the person that's going to take over for me when I left teams inside Google, or, you know, I gave Facebook, I told them basically about 9 months before I was leaving that I planned to leave and go work on climate change at the end of the year. So, you know, I think anything you can do to kind of ease the transition will help keep those relationships in play, and those may help you down the road. Work isn't always going to be fun or something you love, but the more you love what you do, and just as important, the more you love who you work with, or the more you love working with the people you work with, the faster you're going to grow, the more impact you're going to have. It's just easier to kind of put in the work that makes you better and makes your work more impactful. So if that's not happening, if you're not learning, if you don't, you know, you're not feeling it, you don't feel, you know, like at home in a company, it's okay to leave. It's okay to quit. Okay, climate change. How are we doing on time? I think we're doing okay. So as a upfront disclaimer, I believe climate change is real. I believe it is caused by humans, and I believe it is already impacting our lives. Or as Dr. Kimberly Nicholas put it, it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, and we can fix it. There's some great, you know, footnotes on each of those on 350.org/science if you want to challenging those. But I'm not here to convince you of these things. Like, this is not that talk. I want to talk about what we can do about it. And what my path was getting into climate change. So back to my path. So climate change really first got on my radar in 2006 when I saw Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth. And while it made a big impression, I didn't change my life in any big ways. I followed the news on the topic more closely when it was covered. I donated to nonprofits and candidates that worked on it. I even put solar panels on my house and was eager to buy an electric car when my gas car died, which it eventually did after 19 years. I argued with my family in Texas over Thanksgiving dinner, and so on and so on. And then 10 years later, it felt like things were getting worse, not better. And Trump was elected, and donating and voting and solar panels just didn't feel like it was cutting it. I wanted to do more. I was inspired by a friend who made her own 100-day plan of things she was going to do after the election the 2016 election, around the issues she cared about. So I made my own plan, my own 100-day plan around climate change. It included things like being vegetarian for 100 days and considering a career change to go work directly on climate change, and not kind of indirectly. Oh, I'm making, Facebook Messenger better, or this ad platform better, so nonprofits who work on climate change can be like, it was too indirect. I could try to maybe fool myself into thinking that was it, but it wasn't direct enough. And I wanted to vote with my feet, not just my donations and extra time. And so a 100-day plan was exciting because it was kind of non-committal. Like, sure, I can do anything for 3 months, and some change. I thought that worked really well. Going vegetarian, for instance, turned out to be easier than I thought. And so I stuck with it and haven't eaten meat since. I actually have no idea what my last meat dish was, because it was so kind of impromptu. Working on climate change definitely felt like the right move, but I had no idea what that would look like. I wasn't even sure if I'd be doing the same thing or using my, how I'd be using the skills I'd built up over a career at Google and Facebook somewhere else, or I'd be changing careers entirely. And I realized it was going to take some time to figure out. So I might, have to even try a few things. So I plotted out a course to give myself that time. Actually, you could even call it take another gap year, basically. I stayed at Facebook for another 18 months to save up enough money so I could support my family and give myself at least 2 years. So I didn't want just 1 year, but I wanted 2 years to figure out how to make a living working on climate change. And so the first thing I did is when I quit Facebook, I told everyone and their dog that I plan to work on climate change. I sought out and said yes to anything that had anything to do with climate change. I was talking to some company, hey, you should read this book. I'd at least try to read the synopsis of it or the reviews or skim it or check it out from the library, and so on and so on. One of the books I often recommend, if you haven't heard, if you're at all interested in climate change, Drawdown is one of my favorites to recommend. It's an easy read. It's over 100 different solutions to climate change. And I think they go into enough depth, and it's a great way to kind of dip your toe in the pond and see the breadth of climate change. I attended Al Gore's Climate Reality Leadership Conference. There happened to be one up near me. So I was like, yeah, let's do that. A friend of mine was volunteering at a nonprofit in Utah, pushing a carbon tax. I asked if they needed some help and got to volunteer with their branding and their website. And you'll see, like, what I started to realize as I tried things is I started to realize this doesn't quite feel like the right path. And I started to kind of extract lessons and learnings about what did I want to do, what kind of role, what kind of company. So working on a nonprofit or working on advocacy, that didn't really feel like where I wanted to focus. These are important things, but I wanted to work on the solutions more directly. Another friend of mine put me in touch with Grist, which is an independent news outlet here based in Seattle that reports mostly on climate change, but on some other things too. And they were looking to hire someone to build up their advertising platform. And so I offered to do a little bit of consulting. I ended up running a design workshop for them at their board meeting. But I realized through conversations and kind of thinking about it and some of these light touch interactions that wasn't quite right either. I thought this was better. I'd probably learn a lot about a wide range of topics, but I'd also mostly be learning about how to report on those topics and report on climate change. I wouldn't be working on the things directly and really getting into the weeds about how that stuff works. So, and again, I learned by doing, not just by kind of reading. So I wanted to be doing more, something that was closer. Finally, I was put in touch with someone at Nori, a Seattle company building a market for carbon removal. They had a small team. They were interested in hiring me to lead kind of product development. So kind of product and design. This felt more like a job I was qualified for and more like working directly on solution. So I said, yes, absolutely. And I was at Nori for about 2 years, and this is what I learned. So a bit of background on climate change. Carbon is not bad. We're made of carbon, as are plants and animals and a lot of other stuff. In fact, carbon is all over the place. The major pools of carbon are in the fossil layer, the soil layer, the biosphere, that's again kind of plants, animals, us. In the oceans, it gets absorbed down into the oceans, and in the atmosphere. So as humans, eventually we figured out how to extract carbon from the fossil layer. We burn it to power the Industrial Revolution and modern life. And when we did that, the kind of off gases like CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, they go up into the atmosphere and they're absorbed back into the oceans. And then this traps solar, energy and heats up the planet, resulting in climate crisis before us. An interesting stat, humanity only emits 3% of all greenhouse gases that are emitted on the Earth. But the other 97% that are emitted every year are part of a natural carbon cycle. They're emitted, kind of not by us. They're released, but then they're reabsorbed. And it's kind of like the Earth is breathing. Our little 3% is not part of that natural cycle. We're putting it up, but we're not pulling it back down. So it's added up over the last century plus to over 2 trillion tons of excess greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and in the oceans. So at a high level, climate change is pretty straightforward. There is too much of certain gases in the atmosphere. We should reduce our emissions as much as possible, but we also have to remove the rest, right? We have to remove whatever we can't reduce on an ongoing basis, and we need to remove what we put up in the past. And there are things that people and companies and governments can do to make that happen. You'll often see, I feel like most climate change stuff is talking about carbon dioxide. There are other gases that contribute to the problem. Carbon dioxide is the most prevalent greenhouse gas. It's also one that lasts longer in the atmosphere. These gases will dissipate over time. So I think nitrous oxide, I'm going to get it wrong, so I'm not even going to say it. Nitrous oxide and methane are on the order of years to decades. Carbon dioxide can stay up there hundreds or thousands of years. It's crazy. So it's common to convert gases into an equivalent ton of CO2. You'll see this little acronym sometimes, TCO2E, that's tons of CO2 equivalent. So we emit, as humanity, 50 billion tons of CO2 equivalents every year. That's B with a billion. To give you a sense of scale, this is what 1 ton of CO2 looks like. It'll fill up at, at surface level atmospheric pressure, about a sphere of about 33 feet in diameter. So humanity emits over 1,500 of these every second of every day of every year, which adds up to 137 million of those balls every day. Every day of every year, this is how much we're emitting, and we're adding to the atmosphere. So you can see how it kind of fills up over time. So in a less visceral form, here's a graph. And this graph is from the IPCC report in 2019, which is the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, I believe is what that stands for, the UN, I think. I'm going to get that wrong. Anyways. So here's a graph of humanity's emissions and how they've increased over the last century. So they used to be around 10 billion tons or 10 gigatons, up over 50. You've seen they've started to come down a little bit in the last few years as coal is basically just started to lose out to natural gas and renewables is one of the big reasons. And this is a path that's prescribed to get to net zero emissions so humanity can kind of limit the impacts of climate change. We're not going to avoid them, but we are trying to limit them. This is not a guaranteed path by any means. This is the one we're shooting for to kind of minimize the damage. What's interesting is all those emissions is kind of the area under the curve, or here, let's put it a different way. This is the cumulative emissions, right? So this is not how much is happening each year, but what is the total up in the atmosphere and in the oceans that's accumulated over time. And you see, even if we hit zero emissions in 2050, there's still a lot of stuff up in the oceans. So even if we get to net zero, if we turned off everything right now, we still need to deal with this. I think this is I'm kind of totally beating a dead horse here, but here's it in terms of CO2. So it's often talked about parts per million, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, if you go way back before the Industrial Revolution, that was actually below 300 parts per million. And you can see that this is just kind of skyrocketing, well over 400 parts per million now. So if we stopped all emissions on planet Earth, if everything ceased to operate, it would take thousands of years for this concentrate to actually dissipate. So we're trying to accelerate that. You know, the parts per million are too damn high. We need to reduce, we need to actually accelerate the pulling out of carbon out of the atmosphere. So we need to reduce and remove. If there's nothing else you take from this whole talk around climate change, it is not enough to switch to renewables, even though that's going to be hard. It is not enough if, you know, we did all the things to do to reduce our emissions down to zero. We have to also remove past emissions. So we need to reduce emissions as much as possible, and then we need to remove enough greenhouse gases to zero out today's emissions, and then eventually get to negative emissions so that we can be pulling out yesterday's emissions. So this is how I think about working on climate change. Are you working on the reduce part or on the remove part? So let's look at reduce, and then I break each of these down a little bit. So let's look at the reduce part first. Okay, so to reduce emissions, we need to know about where they come from. And there's four nearly equal sources. There's transportation, getting people and things from point A to point B. There is generating electricity and energy to power our world. There is agriculture and land use. And there's manufacturing and construction, making things. So we have good ideas on how to address the first two. You know, the electrification of transportation, using wind and solar and batteries to generate energy we need to power the power we need to generate the energy we need to power our world. These solutions are already outperforming their fossil fuel counterparts. We need to massively scale these up in a very short amount of time. So it's not enough that they're better. We need to adopt them very quickly. So we need to accelerate that. That's why things like, tax credits on, electric cars is still a good idea, even if are getting to the point where they are comparable. We need unfair competitive advantage on these types of technologies so we can accelerate their adoption. Out of the things that can be done about climate change, like moving to 100% renewables, I invested in, and I went to some interesting kind of post-mortems, if you will, on carbon taxes up here in Washington State. Moving to 100% renewable energy is one of the easiest to get people behind, and has some of the highest levels of support from American public. So you're going to see a lot of push from that from politicians, but remember that is 25% of the problem, right? Moving to renewables. It's very important, and absolutely we need to do it, but it's not everything. So for agriculture, we need not just to preserve our forests, we need to expand them. On farms, we know ways to reduce emissions, but we don't know ways to eliminate them. And even those practices are only used by a minority of farmers. So there's a lot of work to be done to incentivize and promote and make those practices used by all. For manufacturing, especially things like making concrete and making steel, which generate a lot of greenhouse gases, we don't know how to solve those emissions. So there are, I think of this as there are big sectors, right, that span thousands of companies and all kinds of interesting things. You could go work on scaling up where we have an idea and we're constantly trying to improve and trying to accelerate the adoption. Or you could go work on the let's figure it out. We don't know what the heck to do, or we have some ideas, but we're still, it's even earlier stage. And that's how I kind of think about the reduce part. So the remove part, we can't reduce our way out of this, as I said earlier, right? It's impossible for emissions to get to zero. And even then, if it was possible, it's double impossible to have reducing emissions undo past emissions. It's just not how it works. That's not how physics works. We need to build up methods to remove emissions. And at first, this will help us get to zero emissions, but in the long term, it'll help us get to negative emissions and remove past emissions. So the good news is we do have tools to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So there are technologies, called direct air capture is one of them. This is like a big machine that literally pulls CO2 out of the air as it kind of goes through the machine. Really fascinating stuff. And there's different ways of doing that. And there's different kind of competing techniques. But this kind of technology has the potential of working at the scale we need to truly address climate change. But the technology is still prohibitively expensive. There's a lot of hard business engineering and science challenges to scale up this technology. Just because I think this is kind of such an interesting one, I'm going to flash up. Here's a few companies that are kind of leading in this space. Carbon Engineering up in Canada, they're pulling it out and turning it into kind of, you could brand it as carbon neutral jet fuel. Climeworks, which is what this picture is from, is over in Zurich, and Global Thermostat, which is based out of New York. And Global Thermostat has made some pretty impressive claims as to how cheap they think they can get this, down to about $100 a ton, which is still 10x what it needs to, where it needs to be, but it's getting closer. So once the CO2 is removed, it has to be stored somewhere. In the short term, it will be more profitable to turn around and use those gases, right? Be it in carbonated drinks or in carbon neutral jet fuel. Long term, though, I think our best bet is to put it back where we found it, right? Remember that graph of the carbon pools? We need to put it back in the soil layer and the fossil layer and take it out of the atmosphere and the oceans. I think you could also put it to some extent in the biosphere, like so to some extent, like growing up trees and then cutting them down and not burning them, but building stuff out of them. Or there's also interesting ways, like there's like people that make houses out of like straw bales. I meant to look that up, but I didn't, or hay bale. I don't know. There's interesting stuff that you could also do it out of the biosphere, but that's something we need to do about kind of figuring out storage too. So this is actually a plant in Iceland that is taking the removed CO2 and injecting it into basalt rock under the ocean floor, where it'll stay for thousands of years. So, you know, one interesting tidbit in this, I think a lot of people love to draw like you know, gas companies, oil companies as the great, you know, enemy in climate change. And I think they've done a lot of, you know, reproachable things, especially on kind of the disinformation. But I wouldn't be surprised if in like 20 years their businesses start to be based on like you know, like who's good at like drilling down below the ocean floor and mucking around down there, gas and oil and gas. So I wouldn't be surprised if they end up being an ally to, like, you know, okay, now time to put it back. It's not going to be as easy as it was to take out, but we got to do it. Another technology we have is plants and soil. Through photosynthesis, plants suck out CO2 out of the air and store it as carbon in the soil and in the plant biomass itself. Afforestation, which is planting new trees where they haven't been in a while or ever. Regenerative agriculture, which means kind of minimizing soil disturbance during farming or adding cover crops, so there are plants on the field year round or on more of the field, are two good examples. Unfortunately, all the croplands, all the forests in the world, it will not remove enough CO2 to get us out of this alone. It'll get us pretty far. I've seen estimates around like 30 billion tons a year for a few decades. Trees, I think, can continue to go on. That's kind of a renewable one, but soil will reach a saturation point at some point. You can only put so much carbon in the soil. So that's a whole nother vector on it. You know, and then I would say there are industries that cut across sectors, right? There is research and development, whether you're studying the changes that are happening or researching new technologies to improve and accelerate our path to negative emissions. There is information, helping distill and spread valuable information about the state of climate, about the many efforts to reverse climate change. This could be analyst, as a science writer, a PR, even marketing, policy. You know, I don't see how we meet climate change, the challenge of climate change, without governments playing a role. What laws and regulations move us in the right direction and encourage innovation by industry? You know, we got to figure that out. And how do we, you know, bring the populace along board with us? I left Nori in May of this year. And I started a consulting company to help other companies fighting climate change, kind of build up their products. Careers working on climate change are still not obvious or easy to find, but it's getting better. So you got to kind of roll up your sleeves and dig for it. And even if you don't want, you know, don't want to work on climate change, or you don't think that that's kind of your calling, there are things you can be doing to help with this fight. Yale conducts a poll every year asking Americans a bunch of climate change related questions. And the 2020 results just came out. And I thought they were kind of an interesting place to end this talk on. So 72% of Americans, and this is color coded by each county. So the darker, the more you agree, the less dark or bluer, the less you agree. So 72% of Americans think climate change is happening. Only 12% don't think it's happening. And that's gone up a bit. I think it was like 69% the year before. But only 57% believe it's caused by human activities. Or, you know, an even smaller set, only 56%, think that it will harm people in the United States, anywhere in the United States, in the next 10 years, like now or within the next 10 years. And a minority believe climate change will harm them personally, you know, like any above, you know, kind of like a moderate amount or a great amount, as opposed to only 47 think it will hurt them not at all, or maybe a little bit. And the kicker is most people don't discuss climate change with others, right? This is 64% of people rarely or never talk about climate change to others. So one thing you can do is, keep learning, have a curious mind, ask tough questions. I kind of blew through all of it. I think it's okay to be skeptical. It's okay to ask questions. I really, it makes me afraid, the culture that's coming around of like, you need to accept what I'm saying, or, you're either with us or against us. Like, I think we need to have a space for debate and discussion. That's fine. But we also need to not debate things that it's tricky. So just know there's valuable in talking to others with it. With that, here's a bunch of links to different resources, how to get a hold of me, some videos I like around climate change. Nori has a great podcast around climate change. Climatebase.org, used to be climate.careers, is one of the better kind of list of kind of a climate job board, if you will. Airminers.org, they're a great kind of just a group around carbon removal companies, and they have some interesting resources. A couple different reading lists. And then there's this one like climate change class, Terra.do. It's meant for mid-career professionals. So it may not be something that's right for you, but they do say like, hey, you can apply anyway. So if you read it and that looks like something that's interesting, maybe you can, elbow your way in there. Yeah, so let's get to questions.
Great, Michael, thank you so much. I think I'm going through the Dory now. We already have quite a few questions. So I'm going to go through just the ones that are at the top first. Question from Iris, which is, what advice do you think for aspiring product managers do you have for aspiring product managers, and how do you evaluate the different skill sets learned from Google and Facebook versus startup? Is it better to work at big tech earlier on as an intern or later on in your career?
Yeah, so that's a lot of good stuff in there. I think that, yeah, I could fill a whole hour just on this one. I was really eye-opening. Like Google and Facebook do things differently. I think that I'll give you a little. I love thinking about systems, so I constantly kind of like breaking up into like how things work, in kind of a system way thing. So I think that building great products, the skill sets in there are, you could bucket them into kind of 3 different classes. There is having great vision and insight, and that's like also about like really good at observing what's going on around you and kind of intuiting where are things headed, what's valuable, what are the problems we need to solve, and having a vision for how to, here's a way to point the vessel, and let's kind of start marching that way. And we're going to adjust, and learn as we go. But having great vision and being able to kind of communicate that vision and lead a lot of people is a skill in developing great products. Another is great execution, right? Just being able to like get stuff done, keep the trains moving on time, and research and learning and iterating, and a lot of stuff involved in that, looking at data. And then the third bucket, so when I was at Google, I thought those were the 2 buckets. Those are like you need those 2. Not everybody has both. Actually, few people have both. And, so you can have one or the other. The bucket I really saw at Facebook was relationships and just people. And your ability to like everything you do has to do with interacting with people and understanding them, and whether you're selling an idea or an insight or trying to like pitch an idea and then like hear feedback and then build up, like, so there's a lot in there. So I think those 3 skill sets, and then go work at a big company, go work at a startup. At a big company, I mean, I think that, like, I guess what I said is like kind of somewhere in the middle, I think is a great place to start. But I think a great place to start is wherever you start. And Jen, just kind of constantly challenge, like, do you feel like you're growing? Do you feel like you're learning? And it's impossible to know how much you would have learned had you done something else. But if you're happy, you like working with the people you're working with, you feel kind of passionate and energized, you feel like you're learning and growing, that's all you can ask for. And if not, like, go try the next thing, right? Find the off-ramp and go try the next thing. And I think that look for people that you think, you just really admire their work ethic, how they do things, and try to, like, go have coffee with them, like ask them questions. Just like there was a designer at Facebook, at Google, when I started at Google, that I just really admired, and I just like annoyed him. I just like went around, followed around, asked him questions, tried to observe him in like reviews when I could. And he, I kind of became a de facto or an unofficial mentor, if you will, of my choosing. So I think that that's what matters more, is like the people you're working with, and you can find those at big or at small companies. But I do think that like really, really big companies, like Google and stuff, I think it's easy to feel like, oh, that's the pinnacle, like that's definitely where I want to go. And I think there are real downsides working in a really, really big company. It's going to be totally up to like what team you land on, honestly. Most of these big companies, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Google, they have their overarching kind of culture that colors everything. But there's also kind of the microcosm of like your team. And you can find a great team or a bad team where you are learning a lot or not learning anything within any of those. I feel like most of these companies, especially Google and Facebook, the ones I know of, they generally encourage and make it easy to move around between teams. So if you do land on a bad team, try something else. But I don't know if that answers the question. If not, follow up over, hit me up on a messenger or yeah.
Awesome.
What else?
Thank you. The question, in your experience, what companies are the strongest in terms of sustainability?
Yeah, so sustainability is even like, it's an interesting word, right? Like sustainability, if you break it down, is kind of like we want to sustain like what we've got. And so that's sustaining the world, or like stay at kind of level, like we need to go beyond sustainability. And I feel like I was talking to James a little bit before we got started about how like the history of this is there's a fair bit of like greenwashing. Like what would motivate a company, right? So a company is either going to do something about climate change within their own business model or beyond it. And there are companies going beyond it. You look at like what Stripe is doing, what Shopify is doing. They're doing some really interesting stuff. I think what Microsoft has been doing, they've got, one of my videos on my video list is just their announcement of what they've been doing from, I think it was about a year ago, was, I thought, really inspiring. What Google, they just announced they're working towards fully carbon neutral. So what Google's done, and I've talked to some of the people inside that program, I think that's really, so there are real companies that are really committed to that. And those are 4 tech companies I just rattled off that I think are impressively so. But what would drive a company to do something about climate change, right? And I would say like laws, right? Regulation, the government coming and saying, you have to do this. And that the history of government trying to make things happen is an interesting one. One of the ones I often heard of, and I've never really dug into this deeply, so I don't know the details of it, but one of the examples that I was told while I was at Nori of an example where government did really well was getting the lead out of gasoline, where they basically came into industry and said, you have to get the lead out of the gasoline. I don't care how you do it. You have 4 years to do it. You all have to do it. There's no opting out. Go. And the companies were like, but we can't. No, it's going to be too expensive. It's going to be awful. And the government said, we don't care. Lead is bad. Get it out of the gasoline. And they did it. And they, like, industry innovated. They figured it out. They came up with several options where they thought there were none. So I think, regulation, I think, will happen. I think at some point the government will say, like, this is going to get bad enough that the population is going to demand it, and the politicians aren't going to feel like they're going to lose their, job if they don't actually go in and push it. But the government's like the laggard, right? Like they're the last to act. So eventually regulation will drive it. So for the most part right now, it's voluntarily. And so I would say, I'm going to oversimplify, but companies I think are largely doing this either because of good PR, they think it makes them look good, or they can put a label on their product or whatever and say, hey, you can feel good about this as a consumer and buying our product because it doesn't, contribute to this. Or they do it because the company cares, right? They're either their customers are pushing them to it, their investors are, the founders are. They're saying, this is important. I believe in the science. We have to do something. We're going to do it. Is it profitable? No. Is not probably, like, or maybe it will be in certain areas, like changing the light bulbs. That's an easy no-brainer profitable thing. The light bulbs are dead. These ones use less energy, then we spend less on energy. Great. But there's going to be other things. What happens when it's not profitable? That's where it really becomes. So I think in that voluntary space, companies that are doing it purely for PR to look good are going to be more likely to be kind of greenwashing it, right? Like they'll make the big promises, and then when it becomes hard to fulfill those promises, they just won't do them because they already got the good PR for making the promise. So looking at like, hey, what promises did you make and did you keep them? And if you didn't keep them, did you announce you didn't keep them, or did you just let that go silently, like unnoticed? Digging that kind of stuff is not always easy to dig into. But if you can, it's good. Or like, what programs, what are you doing to solve this? What's motivating those programs? You might be able to kind of suss out like, oh, this is more than just PR. You're going well and above and beyond. So Stripe and Shopify, they said, we're spending this million, we're spending 5 million or 10 million to fund other startups and other companies working on this because we need solutions and there aren't enough out there. So like that to me is an example of a company going above and beyond. And the people working on that and the different announcements and stuff, that wasn't just like a one, hey, we made an announcement and we moved on. It's a very active thing, so they clearly care about it. So yeah, that's what I'll say about that. Hopefully that answers it.
Yeah, thank you. Question from Vitor. During your talk, you've mentioned that you've taken classes that helped you to discover more about yourself. Do you have pointers to these classes or books that helped you understand more who you are and how you explore this world? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I very intentionally did not mention the class I took, just because I took it like over 20 years ago and I have no idea what that class is now. I've since, stopped being involved in the organization. I had a lot of friends, like I was really hot to trot on that class when I took it, and a lot of friends took it and were like, well, that was weird. And some were like, yeah, that was cool. But I never felt like, I don't know. So I'll tell you what it is, but take it with a grain of salt. And I think with all the Corona stuff going on, they're not doing a lot of classes, but it's called moretolife.org, M-O-R-T-E, like moretolife.org. It was the Kairos Foundation at the time, and Kairos, I think, is Greek for a moment in time. And the idea is that you can learn, every moment in time, it has like a bunch of lessons to offer you. So it was a little like, I don't know, it was an interesting experience, and I got a lot out of it. As far as books, there's different ones that have had an impact. Like I find often like it's not so much a book like offers some huge platform and like that becomes my way of like thinking about it. It's more that like I find interesting like snippets out of a book jump out at me and just like stick with me. Like the way you kind of remember stuff as you think about it over time. And so I've like found ones that I kind of automatically replay in my head. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People was a fine book, but one of the lines in that book that really jumped out at me was the author was talking about, he was doing a talk and someone came up to him at the talk and said, I'm having a really hard time with my wife and I just don't think it's going to last. I just don't think we love each other anymore. I think we're probably going to get a divorce. I don't remember what he was asking advice wise. And the author said like, well, you need to love your wife. And he's like, no, you don't get it. We just don't love each other anymore. He's like, no, you don't get it. Love is not like a, love is not a feeling. It is a feeling, but it's not just something that happens to you. It's something, it's an action. It's something you do, right? So love your wife, like sacrifice for her, be there for her. What can you do? Like, and so like that always really stuck with me, that like kind of any relationship, be it a professional one or a romantic one, once you stop investing in it, like it's not going to coast like at that level. It's probably going to deteriorate, right? Decay is kind of entropy is real. So you have to invest in it. And that was like something that I got out of a book. But there's lots of good stuff out there, lots of good books, and just try it. And what resonates. And if it doesn't, put it down.
Awesome. I think we'll take one more question here from the Dory. And question from Yara is, what are your thoughts on applying machine learning to aiding the climate crisis? Do you think AI is applicable here?
Yeah, AI is applicable everywhere. So yes, and there's actually even, I've got a bookmark somewhere that's like how to apply AI to machine learning, or how to apply like machine learning and AI to climate change. I'll dig that up. I'll add it to the slides, which I assume you're going to get a copy of. I realize some of the links on here are just linkified text, which is worthless to you. So hopefully you'll get a copy of these, or we'll figure out how to get that to you. I'll make sure I add that to it. So yes. And also I can go another 15 minutes if y'all want, but also happy to end whatever works.
No, that'd be great. There are a few more questions here if you don't mind running over.
I don't mind at all. I don't mind at all.
All right, thanks so much, Michael. Let me pull up the next question. How can we effectively combat climate change when there isn't motivation for many legislators due to non-belief in the issue from their constituents?
Yeah, so like I think there are a lot of really good people working on that, on how to there's a great I think in my my list of videos, there's a TED talk by someone who talks about how to talk about climate change. Like I think it's called Climate Communications is her business, .org.com, Climate Communications, and talks through, and I've seen this also in some of the carbon talks that failed. There are ways of talking about this that everyone gets behind, where it's like, we need to innovate, we need to get to renewable energy, like about building about, free markets. I do think free markets have a role to play. I don't think the government just coming in and saying, this is how it's going to be, doesn't always work out. I think when they can lay the ground rules and then kind of say everybody's playing by the same, level the playing field, and then make sure everyone's playing by those rules, and then letting industry innovate, that can work. But I think when they try to like create the market or buoy the market, I think that typically doesn't work. So there are ways of talking about this that I think work. I'd say vote. For me personally, like I just like that whole problem space, I'm just ignoring. As far as I'm not like, I'll have conversations with my family is the extent of it, but I don't want to spend much time on trying to convince people of what I already believe is so. I'm going to work on acting on what I believe is so. And if somebody wants to have a conversation with me, I'm more than happy to do it. I'm happy to hear of like, interesting, well, what about this? Like that 3% one is one, like a fact that's often thrown around by skeptics. Hey, we're only responsible for 3% of the carbon. How can this be a problem? Well, it turns out our 3% is 100% of the carbon. It's not actually being pulled back down. So that's interesting. There's like climateskeptics.org, I think is a great site. But I think the shift is happening, and I would say go vote, and we'll see. Let's see how the election goes. And I think that if Donald Trump is reelected, I think that is a sign that we still haven't gotten where we need to get. If there's a big Democratic sweep, and I hate that like it's become so polarized that like, yeah, go Democrats. Like I want to be for candidates. I would love to like vote for Republicans that I like, agree with, that are going to do something about climate change. And I think the more people are voting on those issues, you see like Ed Markey in Massachusetts beating out Ted Kennedy. That was a good sign. Not Ted Kennedy, Joe Kennedy. Good sign that climate change matters. So signals to politicians that it's not only safe, but you're in trouble if you're not doing something about climate change, and we're going to vote you out. So we got to go make that happen in enough places. The people have to care. The politicians are very risk averse, and it is very easy for things to, it's a lot riskier, in the day and age of Twitter and cable news media and et cetera. So it's up to us, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, agreed. The next question is shifting a little bit more back to the product focus.
Yeah.
What are things that are absolutely essential for product roles that you've learned between Facebook and Google?
That there is nothing, there's nothing absolutely essential. That's what I've learned. One of my favorite little sayings is there is, what was it? There's no rule that can't be broken in the right way. No, I already botched it. Damn it. There's no rule that can't be broken in the right way, or something like that. I don't know. It's just like there's nothing is absolute. Like nothing is absolute. So I think that I will say that I think there's a lot of things that I can look back on my career and say helped me, right? But there's other people that had very different career paths that were very successful with very different skill sets or very different kind of like, kind of default ways of interacting with the world, et cetera. Like I'm very much kind of a jump in the deep end. I tend to talk too much, not listen enough. I'm very assertive. I'm willing to kind of take on leadership. I'm willing to kind of pick myself up by the bootstraps and say like, I'll figure it out. A lot of that stuff has served me because those were my strengths and I played to them and found a way to do that in a way that was collaborative and didn't box other people out and led to good products being made and my colleagues being happy working with me at the end of the day. But that's not the only way to do it. There are other people that are they're really good listeners and aren't constantly trying to jump in and lead things and all these other stuff that have been successful as well. So I don't think there's an absolute, but always be learning. Try to stay humble. Like no matter. I feel like Google, when I started there, part of what was so great about it was there was really low ego. And so it worked really well for me, someone who's willing to kind of jump in and make a fool of themselves, and just try things and just do things, in an environment that really embraced letting everyone just try things. A good idea can come from anywhere. It doesn't matter how many years experience, what your title is, we're all in this together kind of thing. So I'd say, like, be the best you that you can, love yourself, and constantly kind of figure out how you can be you fully, and do that in a way that works, that it helps you be successful, around you. So listen for feedback and like peer reviews. Man, that was such a gift. Such a gift. That's one of the things you'll get more at a big company. So that's one advantage of a bigger company, is they're going to invest more time in making sure you get feedback, from your manager and your peers. And as with all things, try to hear it. And sometimes they're just wrong. So sometimes someone will say, like, we think that you are too assertive. And you'll like really sit on that and meditate on that, think about it and say, you know what, I just think that's wrong. I'm not going to push on that. But other times you'll think, wow, I never realized that about myself. Just constantly be trying to learn about, whatever you're working on, and how to be a better you, and how to be better at doing what you're doing. And I think loving what you do and who you're working, enjoying work, is what is the shortcut to you putting in the hours and the effort to get really good at work, good at whatever you're doing. That was really the thing for me, is I got really lucky in finding something I loved doing. And so it was really easy for me to just pour myself into it.
Thank you. No, I think that piece on enjoying your work is super salient, and something that I don't have much work experience yet, given that I'm still in college, but I think that has already been very applicable to my experience as well. Question
I'll add
from
one more.
Alejandro.
I'm gonna add one more,
Sure.
which is like prototype stuff. Man, just try stuff out. I love, like, I was really lucky to be a designer with a CS degree, and I would do like these little mini tools and mini classes on like trying to get other designers to code a little bit. And I just love making stuff. And so far as like half the time I make something, I like design something, I mock it up, it looks great, and then I prototype it and I'm like, this is awful. So the real you can make it, the easier it is to learn from it, and kind of, gain your sense of what works and what doesn't. So one other little tidbit.
Yeah, no, thank you. Alejandra asked, working in material research, I was extremely interested in your point how steel manufacturing produces a significant amount of gas emissions. Could you give some advice on any readings, sites, or blogs and companies where we can learn more?
I would just Google it. I think that I saw some headlines around. I think Bill Gates is funding some stuff, or the Bill Gates Foundation might be funding some stuff around there, experimenting with ways of making steel in a more environmentally friendly way. I think some of it is looking for alternatives to steel. So there's interesting stuff around, like, either make the steel more environmentally, make it with less emissions, or use something else. I mean, those are kind of your two options, or I guess just don't build it, but that's not likely to happen. We built something like, man, I was trying to find the stat on this, so don't quote me on this, but it's just one of those things that helps impress you upon. We built something like the equivalent of all the real estate in Manhattan. Like, if you look at all the real estate, everything built globally, we build the equivalent of a Manhattan like every month, I think. Something ridiculous, something like just absolutely mind-boggling how much stuff is getting built. So, concrete and steel, there are efforts in there, and it's early. And it takes a lot of heat is kind of the big challenge there. But I think as our best hope right now is like solar, wind, and batteries somehow get us to a point where we can actually create that heat through other means. And maybe we get to that. Or maybe that's just one that, like, look, it causes greenhouse gases. We can't get rid of it. We need steel. It's a pollutant. So make the pollution and then remove it, right? We need to build up the technology to remove it. And so removing is not only enabling negative emissions of removing past emissions, but it's enabling us to negate the emissions of today that we can't otherwise get rid of.
Yeah, thank you. Question from Joe, which is how has becoming more environmentally conscious benefited your work ethic and productivity? He's very thankful for the talk.
So it's helped and it's hurt. It's helped in that, again, back to like, I'm working on something I really feel strongly about. So by the end of my time at Facebook, like I loved working on communication products and helping people like connect and communicate. And to me, like, I'm somewhat skeptical of how strongly like Facebook like newsfeed helps us all connect. I think there are definitely positives has, but like messaging, I think is a more pure win to me. So I was excited to go work on Messenger for a while, and there was some interesting stuff there. But like I just was like, it just wasn't getting me, getting my wheels spinning as much. So working on something you feel really passionate about helps. So that's helped there. Feel more motivated, and like at Nori and then the consulting I'm doing right now, like I very much kind of went back to that. Like I'll do anything. I'll mop the floors. I'll like whatever it takes. What do you need me to do? Like are we working on climate change directly? Great. Give me a broom. Like, so I think it got me back to that mentality of kind of like willingness, right? Of more willingness. And so that led to interesting roles and different experiences. And also I think that helped me inside even the companies I was at. I was like, oh, I see a problem. It's not in my job description to fix that problem, but it's a problem. Is anybody going to fix that? No. Okay, now that's my problem. I'm taking it on. I mean, it's still our problem as a company, but I'm going to spearhead trying to address it. And does everyone agree that's a problem? Yes, we all agree. Okay, well, here are the options. How are we going to address it? Is that, where does it sit on the priority list, et cetera? So that willingness, I think, is helped and served me be more successful at the places I've worked so far on climate change. Where I think it's hurt productivity is like, it's just a downer, man. Like spending time thinking about, it's exciting to think about the solutions, but then like as you get into the solutions, you realize how far behind we are. Like, and I think that it's easier when you're kind of like, oh yeah, like, we're going to switch to renewable energy. That's going to fix it. Like I gave you all a big, dose of reality today, right? And saying like, we are behind. Like we're not in a good place. And we can, and like, I think that there will never be a time where we shouldn't keep trying. They're just never, they're just, when I'm like physically on fire myself, I guess is when I stop, like when it's actually threatening my livelihood. At that point, we'll go back to like the Maslow's, chain of or whatever, Maslow's, I don't know, but like, if my own health and security is taken care of, like this is what I'm going to be working on as long as it takes. I think to balance that, I actually work on some other stuff. I also care a lot about like kind of the general balance of like of technology and like distraction and attention and some other stuff. And so like there's some other side projects I do to kind of give myself a break from it. So there's like kind of climate change, and I'm like, I need to take a break from that. I'm going to work on this other stuff that's a little bit more in my wheelhouse, that scratches another itch. And having that as kind of a balance has helped a little bit. It's part of how I've tried to maintain my mental health.
Awesome. Thank you. I think we'll have one more question here from the Dory, which is back to product development. The question is, working in user experience, how early in the product development process did you get involved?
It varied on different projects, but as I said, I co-founded Google Inbox. I co-founded Google Fi. So in those two instances, I was one of the two co-founders at the very beginning. At the like, should we do this? Why? Like, we need this project, and this is why. There were other projects where I jumped in late, and other designers were involved earlier, or sometimes there weren't designers involved earlier. And so I think that it's always good for design and research to be involved from early on. But I also think sometimes design and research like slows things down. And is like, oh, wait, we got to do it just in this right way. I learned like, this is one of like, we saw people come out of college or out of graduate school with like, great, here's the process. We go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we're like, yeah. No, that's just not, that rarely works that way. So I was somewhat lucky, having a computer science degree gave me more of a technical background, but not having a design degree let me be a bit more flexible in my approach to things. And I think there were things I would have gotten out of a design degree, but mostly I got my design degree just being a designer at Google. Like I became a designer while being a designer in a lot of ways. So I didn't like how can I help? How can we make things better? Wherever things are at, I'm here now, complaining that I wasn't there earlier. Isn't worth doing. And then I wouldn't always force projects. Like some projects, there's a couple slides I skipped. Let me see if y'all will bear with me for just a sec. I'll go find them. I think I can do this. Give me a sec. This will be a fun little. This is a good. It's a good set of slides to end on. It's not climate change, but that's fine. Don't skip this. And then present. And then share my screen. Okay. Technology in general has kind of an arc to it. In the beginning, it's like, can it do the thing at all? Does it just even function? So I think I had some like speaker notes on this, and I don't have them up. So I think I was going to ask the question, like, which of these products is better? I think a lot of people would choose the iPhone as like the better product. The truth is, all of these were successful products, you know, in their time. The phone on the left cost the equivalent of $10,000 in 2020. It was $4,000 in 1983, I think. It took 10 hours to charge the thing. It only made phone calls, and it had about 30 minutes of talk time. Couldn't swap out the battery. It was a ridiculous product, right? But it worked. If you wanted to have a call on the beach, that was the only way to do it. So technology has its cycles, and in the beginning is kind of like, is it functional? And so knowing when a product is like addressing a real need, but is at the stage where it's like raw and like just nothing like it exists, it doesn't have to have the best experience. Like, will a better experience help that? Sure. But you don't have to like get in the way. Sometimes getting to market sooner or evolving the tech stack is more important. The middle one is kind of like the feature war, right? Like often it's hard to skip this one, and I don't think it's always great, but typically the technology starts to become more of a commodity and starts to be everybody has it. Okay, everyone's making cell phones. How do I differentiate? I put more bullet points on the front of the box, right? How many? I have that little grid of like, here's my product, and then here's the competitor's products, and like, here's 20 things. Mine has them all, and the competitor doesn't have them. And eventually somebody comes out and says, you know what, we don't actually need all these friggin' features. We just need a better experience. So the iPhone, when it came out, it didn't do third-party apps. A lot of other apps did. So a lot of other phones did. The BlackBerry Pearl in the middle there did do third-party apps, did do 3G. The iPhone, when it first came out, didn't even do 3G. It was 2G only. It cost 3 times as much as the Pearl. It was $600 at the time, which was crazy for a phone. Phones would be getting cheaper and cheaper at that point. There's all these things it didn't do. It didn't do video. It didn't have a flash on the camera. The camera was like 1.3 megapixels or maybe 2 megapixels. It was a really bad camera. It was not a great device and via a lot, and that's why a lot of people, you know, said this is awful. It's expensive, and it doesn't do all these things. Doesn't have all the check boxes, but it was a great experience. They got enough things right, and that's why it was so successful. You know, and in that great experience is great design, but also great technology, right? The amount of investments they made in making touch really reactive and work really well is really impressive. So it's good to get involved early, but there's no one way to do it. There's no one way to build a product. There's no one way, you know, and it depends on who you have and where the tech is at, where the product is at. It depends on so many things. And so I don't subscribe to it always having to be one way. And so,
awesome. Michael, thank you so much. I will recommend, if students have questions that they haven't had answered, to follow up with Michael after this. But thank you so much. I think this was a really important kind of conversation to have, in both in addressing sort of the product role and also your intersection and sort of trip into working on climate change. So thank you so much. And yeah, looking forward to being in touch.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to listen to me drone on about stuff. And I hope some of it was helpful. Whatever was helpful, use that. Whatever wasn't or didn't resonate, ignore it.
Yeah,
So,
good luck with your multiple kids on Zoom accounts right now. I hope it's all working out.
we've got 4 people on Zoom in my household right now. So we managed through it as far as I can tell. So
yeah,
we'll find
worked
out.
great. All right.
All right.
Have a great